So tonight in our class, in a few minutes, we're going to discuss kind of continuing that series of heroes of faith. But tonight we're going to talk about Noah. And a lot of us have probably heard that story. We could probably recite a lot of the details of that story. But when you think about that story, there's two aspects I want us to think about that we'll kind of flush out tonight, but that I kind of just want us to think about for a second that correlate with the New Testament. When you look at 1 Peter chapter 3, there's a connection between Noah and God in the Old Testament story that happened with the flood and the ark. And when you look in 1 Peter chapter 3, starting in verse 18, it says this: "For Christ also suffered once for sins, the righteous for the unrighteous, that he might bring us to God, being put to death in Christ, but made alive in the Spirit, in which he went and proclaimed to the spirits in prison, because they formerly did not obey, when God's patience waited in the days of Noah, while the ark was being prepared, in which a few, that is, 8 persons, were brought safely through water. Baptism, which corresponds to this, now saves you, not as a removal of dirt from the body, but as an appeal to God for a good conscience, through the resurrection of Jesus Christ, who has gone into heaven and is at the right hand of God, with angels, authorities, and powers having been subjected to him." It's a pretty powerful little section of Scripture, especially when you think about Christ. You think about what he's done and how that correlation between God flooding the earth and God cleansing us with those same exact waters. But there's something in there, in that passage, that's pointed out about God's character. And it's something that we're going to spend some time tonight thinking about, because I really think that as Christians it impacts our faith and the faith and the relationship that we have with Christ. But if you'll notice, in verse 20, it says, "When God's patience waited in the days of Noah, while the ark was being prepared, in which a few, 8 persons, that being Noah, were preparing themselves for the water." It's interesting to note that God was patient. Like, God knew what he was going to do. God knew the plan that eventually he was going to flood the entire earth. He was going to try to rid the whole earth of how deep and how big of a degree of sin that these people were entrenched in. He was going to try and get rid of that. But there was patience. Why? Well, clearly so that Noah and his family could board the ship, could create the boat, the ark that they were going to live on for a little while, so that he could put animals on there, right? Try to return the earth back into this Eden type of world. But I wonder if there was ever a point in that time of waiting that there was ever a chance that Noah and the 7 other family members that were going to get on that boat, if there was ever a chance that maybe them being the good, by being faithful to God, it could have ever had an impact on some of the people. Clearly it didn't. I mean, God wiped the entire earth because he saw that it was all evil, but I can't help but wonder, was there a chance that that was possible? Well, when you think about Noah, I think about the series that the teens and I have been going through as we've been studying on Sunday mornings, called Be the Good. You've probably seen some of the red t-shirts with Be the Good across the chest. We've been studying several different characters throughout the Bible, several different experiences, stories that happened within the Old Testament and the New Testament. And the first person that we hit was Noah. And when we came across him, we came across the similar study that we're going to do tonight, is we talked about a faith and how it impacts us, how it changes our relationship with God, and how we can grow spiritually to kind of form off of the good parts and even off of the bad parts, so we don't fall into that temptation to be these people of faith, to possibly be our own heroes of faith. And when I think about that, I couldn't help but think of one point that we made, that during that time of waiting, and even before God revealed his plan to Noah, there's this idea that be the good is even when we're the only ones that are doing it. Like, we need to be the good when nobody else around us is trying to be the good, because God is patiently waiting for each of us to be the Christians that he wants us to be, that he's adopted us to be, but also to let other people know about the hope that's found in Christ. And so tonight we're going to talk a little bit more about Noah and about his faith. But if there's anything that we can do for you tonight, if we can pray for you, won't you come as we stand and as we sing this song?
Mr. Classes.
This story of Noah, right? And this is a story that most of us could probably talk about with ease. A guy builds a boat to save his life and to save his family's life. He's told to take up 2 of every kind of animal, more of the clean animals, and they get on the boat, and God saves them. They get off the boat, they give a sacrifice, and life continues on as normal, or so to say, as they kind of repopulate and things kind of start over again. This Eden type of world that we're dealing with. And like I said a moment ago, when we're talking about the youth class, we've been studying that series, Be the Good. And every time that we've talked about this class, I've tried to remember to say this because I think that it's extremely powerful and it brings a little bit more perspective to the study of people within the Bibles, experiences that people have had within the Bibles, and those lives and the interactions and the decisions and the relationships and everything that they went through. I think it's important to remember that it's not about being perfect. And we've talked about in the youth class when we've studied David, or when we studied Jonah, Noah, Abraham, we've studied Paul, or we're going to study Paul. We've studied Timothy, Mary and Martha. Like all of these people, it doesn't matter who you are. It's not about being good enough, and it's not about reaching this state of being perfect. Because I think we would all realize we're never going to make it to that perfect state. Like we're never going to be perfect like Christ is perfect. But sometimes, and I know I do this in my life, a lot of times we expect a lot out of ourselves. And so when we mess up, we go through this rut of beating ourselves up because we didn't make the right decision, or we made the wrong decision, or we went the wrong way, or whatever it is. And we're extremely hard on ourselves internally, and we can't let some of those things go. And so it's not about being perfect. And what we're going to see with Noah tonight is that the flood happens, they get off the boat, and apparently he knew and his family knew, and previously, before getting on the boat, they knew that they needed to give sacrifices to God. And at the end of Genesis chapter 9, we kind of get a little bit of a flip of the story. Like as Noah goes and he sacrifices these animals to God, and he gives the best of what they have, God, it says in the text, like it was like a sweet aroma to him. Like it was something that was pleasing. It was something that was good and perfect and exactly the way he wanted it. And then he gives the covenant, the promise to Noah and his family and the entire earth from then on until now and into the future that he would never flood the earth again. But then right after that, you sneak into this little story sneaks in verse 20 of chapter 9. That Noah began to be a man of the soil, and he planted a vineyard, and he drank of the wine and became drunk and laid uncovered in his tent. And Ham, the father of Canaan, saw the nakedness of his father and told his brothers outside. And then Shem and Japheth took a garment, laid it on their shoulders, and walked backwards and covered the nakedness of their father. Their faces were turned backwards, and they did not see their father's nakedness. And when Noah awoke from his wine and knew what his youngest son had done to him, he said, "Cursed be Canaan, a servant of servants, shall he be to his brothers." And he kind of goes on with that idea. But it's interesting to note, Noah was not always perfect. Like this guy has the most miraculous thing happen in his life, and he ends up in the same boat as every single human being pre-flood. And so you kind of get this taste and this glimpse of, yeah, we're studying heroes of faith, but heroes of faith still had failures. Heroes of faith still had shortcomings. They still had sin and temptation that they had to deal with in life just in the same way as we do. And so there's things that we're going to struggle with, but I think at the same time we can still be heroes of our own faith. We can be heroes of faith in our communities here at this church, in the communities that we go out to, that we live in, and that we work in, and that we're involved with, and even to the bigger worlds, into the nations and into the worlds. That we can be these heroes of faith, regardless of some of the mistakes and some of the things that we might do to beat ourselves up. And so tonight, I'm going to go out on a limb here, all right? This is an auditorium class, as I was told. And I almost did this last time, but I didn't want to do it. But this time, I think I'm getting a little bolder, all right? I'm stepping out a little bit. So don't let me down. Because what I tell the teenagers on Sunday morning is I'm just going to stand here and it's going to be really awkward until we, get somewhere. So I have a question here, and you're free to point answers out as you feel. And I'll repeat them so that everybody can hear them. But what makes them, when we're talking about them being Noah, Jonah, David, any of the people that have been studied in this series and that could be studied, Paul, Timothy, anybody. You can think about anybody in the Bible. What makes them heroes of faith in the first place? And you're free to answer as you feel. Yeah. Okay, obedience. Yeah, like maybe they had, and to a sense, Noah was kind of that same way. Like he knew what was coming, but he didn't know the extent of everything that was going to happen, but he was still obedient. Absolutely. I think it's a phenomenal answer. What else? You've already beat the teenagers. Let me just say that. I mean, we'd have been 5 minutes in and one answer would have been given. What do you think? Trusting God? Absolutely. There's kind of that sense in which, like, you put all these answers together, and Dwayne was right. Like, these things are unthinkable by us. Noah would have never thought to flood the earth. No way. Jonah wouldn't have said, I'm going to run the opposite direction, and the way I'm going to fix myself is jump overboard and get swallowed by a fish. No shot. But trusting God, obedience, and this, like, understanding that's further than ours, absolutely. Harold? Absolutely. Harold said, and I think he put it perfectly, when you're talking about heroes of faith, yeah, they weren't perfect, but man, they kept after it. They were persistent in what they did. That's a great answer. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, the visible like majority, like you said, God is the majority, but in a sense, like the visible majority was all of the other people that were the opposite ways of living than Noah and his eight. Yeah, talk about a imbalance there. Look at Noah. Is there any other answers before we're going? I think those are all right. I think those are absolutely right. We'll have another discussion question, so be preparing yourself. Don't think you're off the hook yet. But those are all great answers. And I think you can see a lot of those characteristics no matter which different person, no matter which story, no matter which experience that you talk about when it comes to either in the Old Testament or the New Testament, heroes of faith. We have Hebrews chapter 11, and it outlines all kinds of people, even people that you wouldn't expect, right? Like Rahab's in there. It's like, somebody had to get a mix-up, right? Like somebody had to be writing that and heard the complete wrong story. Because you're putting her in there, but she was a person of faith. And you see how that unfolds when her back was against the wall. And so you can see a lot of these people who have this same kind of faith. So let's back up and let's look at the story of Noah. What I want to do tonight is not necessarily talk about like every single aspect of the story of Noah. I think all of us probably have a pretty general good idea of what happened with Noah and the whole story following through the flood and after the flood and the things that happened. I want us to really kind of narrow in on maybe some of the characteristics of Noah. Some of the things that he did and he was involved in that makes him the perfect candidate, really, to be a hero of faith. When you look at Genesis chapter 6, that's where the story of Noah begins. And when you look at verse 1, it says this: when man began to multiply on the face of the land and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of man were attractive, and they took as their wives any that they chose. Then the Lord said, my spirit shall not abide in man forever, for he is flesh. His days shall be 120 years. And the Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward when the sons of God came into the daughters of man, and they bore children to them. These were the mighty men who were of old, the men of renown. The Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intention and the thoughts of their hearts were only evil continuously. I think there's an interesting point that we easily miss over when we try to jump forward to, hey, the whole world's in chaos. Like there is sin everywhere. Every kind of evil that's being practiced is happening here. Like everything that could go wrong is going wrong plus more. Like as far as our minds can go, you take that even further and we see problems happening in the world at this point. But when you look at the beginning of chapter 6, it's a pretty hot topic. If you're an Old Testament scholar, I wouldn't call myself that. But there's an interesting point that I think that we can see here. Notice in verse 2, it says, the sons of God saw that the daughters of men were attractive. And so they took them as wives and they had daughters with them, and there's a huge debate. What does that even mean? You know, like what is that? Who are those guys? Are they angels? And you kind of get to the point where it's like, oh, they're not angels because of this, this, and this. And there's a whole argument. I mean, we could spend 30 minutes on this, and we don't need to. But fast forward, I'll just give you the answer. I'll give you the easy stuff, right? Some think that it was somebody in the line of this lineage in chapter 5. When you go through the lineage of Adam, a lot say that it could be from Seth's lineage. And when you see the name sons of God or daughters of God, like this idea is that we are, like God has adopted us, right? He's taken us in. He's covered us. We're a part of His family. And we see Christians in the New Testament called this. Sons and daughters of God, or we've been put into the body of Christ. We're a part of the body of Christ, or any kind of different lingo like that. That idea of sons of God, like these were people that belonged to God. And so in some way, somehow, along that lineage and line, there's an idea that people that were obeying God, that were obedient, that were trusting Him, that had faith in Him, a relationship with Him, those are the sons of God. So if you take that idea, and there's no way of being 100%, but I think that's the closest we can get to an answer. When you think about these people and the idea that they could be faithful people on this earth, what it kind of turns out to be is like there's these faithful people, but when you jump to verse 5 and forward, you get this idea that the whole world is just full of sin. Like this whole world is evil and there's no good, and that these sons of God had even turned away from Him. Like these sons of God, these people that belonged to God had turned away from Him and were choosing to live a completely different lifestyle. And what's interesting about that idea is if you couple that with 1 Peter, when you talk about the idea of 100 and like this long period of waiting, like how long did it take Noah to build the ark? I have no idea. There's a lot of people that go back and forth. Let's say it's 100 years, right? There's this waiting, this huge waiting period while he's building the ark. This sin just kept getting deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper. And the question becomes then, helps if you turn it on, how seriously do we view the infection of sin? Because as these sons of God became more and more involved with evil and more involved with sin, it's like they just kept turning further and further and further away from God. They kept directing their attention somewhere else, yet God, being patient, gave them time to repent. Gave them time to turn around and to focus on Him and to view Him as He is. And so you get this idea that sin is a whole lot bigger and a whole lot more powerful than we give it credit sometimes. Like sometimes we view sin as like this mutual agreement, right? Like when Lauren and I, we got married, we had a photographer there. And she sends you this 10-page packet of nonsense that you're supposed to sign, right? And it's like all the fine print, everything you're supposed to provide, everything you're supposed to do. And we, on our side, mutually agree with her that we're going to uphold our side and she's going to uphold her side. And we should have added like what the timeline was of getting our pictures back. But, regardless, right? We had to have lunch for her when she was there. She had to be a part of the reception. There were certain things that we had to give her. We had to pay a certain deposit. We had to pay another part at a certain time. Like, there's all these rules that you have to read through and decipher and figure out where she's supposed to be, how she's supposed to get somewhere, how she's supposed to know this, all of this stuff. We had to mutually across, communication agree that, hey, we're good with our side of the deal if you're good with your side of the deal, and we sign the papers. There's a lot of those mutual agreements that we have to come to in life. My mom would always tell me that sometimes just don't even argue, just agree to agree, right, and move on. Because at the end of the day, it's not that big of a deal. The arguments me and my sister would get in are kind of like what Lauren has said. It's like, hey, my sister looked out my window of the car, right? And it's like, that's not a big deal. And then you start fighting about it and you get onto each other. Just agree to agree. And that's kind of what a mutual agreement sometimes comes down to. Hey, I'm not totally in line with these terms, but hey, you're kind of meeting me halfway. And that's kind of the way that we view sin sometimes. Like, we mutually agree with sin. And we might not think about it that way. We might not recognize it that way. But I think that's the way that things started to head for these, descendants of Seth or whoever these sons of God are. Like, there was this time that they kind of mutually agreed with sin. They kind of flirted with sin. They were really, really close to sin, a whole lot closer than they should be. And what happens is you start to compromise, right? You're like, if you'll stay over there and I'll stay over here, like I'll give you this if you give me this, and we'll be good. But we'll keep our distance. We'll stay just far enough away so we're not seen together, but just close enough to where you're there whenever I need you. And that's kind of the way that we deal with sin. And when you look at the story of Noah, God is separating good from evil. There's this flood that happens, rids the whole world of evil, and tries to re-implement moral good. He tries to redirect them back to Him. He's like, I don't want you to have a mutual agreement. I don't want you to have an agreement at all with sin. I want you to be completely separate from sin. And when you look at Hebrews chapter 11, in the one little verse that Noah has there, you see this idea. It says, by faith, Noah being warned by God concerning events as yet unseen, in reverent fear, that being of Noah to God, constructed an ark for the saving of his household. By this he condemned the world and became an heir of the righteousness that comes by faith. What kind of effect is sin having on you right now? What does it look like? You don't have to answer that out loud. That's not a discussion question. But think about that for yourself. Be really, really honest. And that can be difficult. But be honest with yourself. What kind of effect is sin having on your life? Are you actively trying to push sin away? Or are you kind of in a mutual agreement with sin? When you back up out of this story and you just look at what God has done, God allowed this time for Noah to save his family. He is just in the fact that He provides the flood that He said He would provide. And then to take a step even more, when they get off the boat, He makes a covenant with them to say, never again will I flood the earth like this. Never again am I going to kill every single human except for some. And never again am I going to kill all of these animals again. I'm never going to do that again. And that's a promise that He's kept till now. But when you look at that idea, I think you get this idea that trails through the entirety of the Bible, from the story of Noah all the way into Romans chapter 3, where you kind of see this idea of how God deals with sin shows His character. How God deals with sin shows how He's just. how God deals with sin, shows exactly His righteousness, His mercy, and His grace. When you look at Romans chapter 3, you get this idea, and it kind of unfolds because what Paul is going to say later in chapter 6 is like, are you going to keep on sinning so that you can get more grace? And it's like ridiculous, right? Like, no, you're not going to keep on sinning so that you can just keep getting grace to make God look better, but ourselves look worse. And in chapter 3 and verse 3, Paul says, what if some were unfaithful? Does their faithlessness nullify the faithfulness of God? By no means. Let God be true, though everyone were a liar, as it is written, that you may be justified in your words and prevail when you are judged. But if our unrighteousness serves to show the righteousness of God, what shall we say? That God is unrighteous to inflict wrath on us? I speak in a human way. By no means. For then how could God judge the world? But if through my lie God's truth abounds to His glory, why am I still being condemned as a sinner? And why not do evil that good may come? As some people slanderously charge us with saying, their condemnation is just. You get a big view, you get a big picture idea of exactly who God is. And especially in this story, right? He goes through with His promise. He says, I'm going to flood the earth. That shows His justice. At the end, Noah comes off the boat, right? And he says, and that's again showing the grace and the mercy of God. Yeah, Noah's seen as a blameless and upright person, but he wasn't perfect. But he was striving to be like God. He was striving to walk hand in hand with God. And so once again, God's righteousness, justice, mercy, grace, and ultimately His love is seen on the biggest scale on this earth. And so there's no room for a agreement or a mutual agreement with sin. When you look at Genesis chapter 6, when you bounce back to the very first book of the Bible, we won't be bouncing around so much. But chapter 6, starting in verse 5, says this. The Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intention of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continuously. Like, no good whatsoever. And that's interesting. It's interesting that not at any part in this was there ever, hey, there are some other good people. There's some decent people. There's some okay people. No, it's like very black and white. Like there are evil people and there's Noah's little clan of really good people. These people were greedy to practice every kind of sin. They wanted more and more and more. And Paul talks exactly about that. In verse 6, and the Lord regretted that He had made man on the earth, and it grieved Him to His heart. You get some true human emotions there. Like you see how we were created in the image of God, because God is grieved to the deepest part of who He is. At the fact that man, with their free will decision, chose to sin rather than obey Him. Rather than choosing to serve the Creator of the world. Verse 7 says, so that the Lord said, I will blot out man who I have created from the face of the land, man and animals and creeping things and birds of the heavens, for I am sorry that I have made them. I think there's a sense here in which when you look at God and you see the image of who we are, there's that feeling of like, you've been in a situation maybe in your life where someone's made a decision and it's affected you directly. Like maybe they made a terrible decision in life, they muddied their life up, and it directly affected you, like to the deepest point. Like you're grieving their decision. Or maybe you've made that decision and it hurt somebody else, and so ultimately you see how you've hurt somebody, and it's like the deepest point of just pain and hurt, knowing that you hurt somebody else and there's nothing you can do to take it away. Or what about if someone just simply makes a decision and hurts themselves? God feels the pain of betrayal, and this is exactly how God is personal to each and every one of us. And that's what's so cool about this story of Noah, is how personal it gets. And so when I think about God in this scenario and Him being the ultimate factor in everything that's going on, this story revolving around God, I can't help but think we often want to avoid thinking that our sin hurts Him. But do we ever think about our sin deeply affecting God in this exact same way that happened in verse 6 and in verse 7? Do we avoid thinking about it because we know that we've hurt Him? Do we avoid it because then we have to suppress our emotion, or we have to really worry about it or think about it? It really brings out these true emotions. Do we ever think about the other end of our sin problem? Do we ever consider into play the other side of the covenant, the other side of the agreement? And that's something that can be extremely difficult, but I think in the lives of all Christians, all of us, need to take time and reflect on that, because I think there's something that our faith can grow deeper into, being God, if we acknowledge some of that. In the last verse, but Noah found favor, this is verse 8, but Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. And so it kind of begs the question, what did he do to find favor in God? Like, what exactly unfolded that he was considered blameless, upright? Some translations say perfect, even though he's not a perfect human, but trying to follow in the steps of God, this holiness effect of he's trying to follow God, and so there's this sense of righteousness, like being seen right before God. Like, what did he do to find favor with God? What steps did he take to find favor? And I think we see he believes in God. Absolutely. Absolutely. There's a sense in which is there an attention to favoring, right? And I think that goes to this point exactly. Even when no one was impressed, God was. Like, God was impressed enough to say that, you know what, Noah, you're upright. You're trying to follow me. You're trying to find favor in me. You're trying to be seen right before me. And even though everybody in the world is doing the opposite of what you and your family are doing, you're trying to impress me, being God. You're trying to be upright. You're trying to be perfect. You're trying to be blameless in your generation, regardless of all of the junk and all of the hurdles that you're going to have to overcome for however many unknown years to Noah to build this boat and to ultimately be saved. I think when you think about Noah being a hero of faith, I can't help but think in verses 22 of chapter 6 and in chapter 7, verse 5, it says the exact same thing. But it kind of slides it in verse 22. It says, Noah did this. He did all that God commanded him. What was that? It was all the rules, all the commandments that Noah had been given by God to how to build the boat, exactly what length, exactly what kind of animals to bring, everything down to a T he was given. And it says that Noah had the kind of faith that followed every single one of those commands. He didn't leave a single one out. Like, he didn't forget about one because he didn't want to deal with it. He didn't kind of leave it out because it was uncomfortable. He did every single one of them. And when you think about the ark, that's what saved Noah and his family, right? Like, God gives him the instructions, and that's what saves his family. They were the only ones saved. And when you think about what saves us, it's Christ. Christ is the one who saves us. And when you kind of mesh those two together, it's kind of funny because Noah could have left some animals off if he wanted to. Like, if I was really in the game for leaving some animals off, snakes, number one. Forget about it, dude. Just kill them. Mosquitoes, how did those survive, right? Kick them off the boat. Like, you're talking about gnats, those things are annoying. It took forever to get those out of our apartment last week. Like, get rid of them, man. Like, anything else that's annoying or I just don't want to deal with, like, man, forget about it. Like, I'm leaving that sucker off the boat because I ain't messing with that. But Noah follows God's plan exactly. And that's the kind of faith that we need to have. Like the kind of faith that doesn't look at God and says, all right, I'm going to pick and choose kind of some of the aspects of Christianity that I want to follow. No, it's understanding that when we become, or when we put Christ on, when we are in Christ, when we're in salvation, when we're disciples of Him, we take on every single aspect of Christ. That means the comfortable ones and the uncomfortable ones. That means the ones that are fun, ones that are not so fun. The ones that are convenient and easy for us and ones that are not so convenient and easy. The ones that we have talents for and ones that we feel pretty inferior to. We feel pretty insignificant to. I think that all comes out when you think about the kind of faith that Noah had. When we talk about this kind of faith that Noah had, sometimes we kind of base our Christianity and the decisions that we want to make off of our feelings. Like we allow our feelings to be a driving factor in the decisions that we make. I read a book one time, I think it was like a pre-marriage book, right? Like someone handed it to me and they're like, all right, read this, it'll change your life. And I was like, okay. So I read it, read a couple chapters and it's talking about love. And I'm like, dude, next chapter. Like talking about like feelings. I'm like, next chapter. Like all these things that I don't want to read about, right? And I'm like skipping through and I get to page like 50, right? And I don't know what happened here. But like I open the book and this guy's talking about how in a relationship, there's going to be times where love is not a feeling, right? Like there's not going to be this just movie set, Hallmark edition love going on between you and whoever else. You and a family member, you and your spouse, you and a friend, whatever. But there's times that even when you don't feel that love, you're going to show it because that shows the affection of love. That shows that you love somebody. And that feeling doesn't always have to be there. I think as Christians, as we talk about a 21st century world that we're living in and we're supposed to be radically different, feelings can't always drive our faith. Feelings can't always drive our Christianity because those feelings aren't always going to be there. There's going to be times where we're struggling and we're looking at an uphill battle. And it's like, how does God love me? How can I feel like I love God right now to the deepest potential, the maximum? It's not always going to be there. But we know that that drives us deeper into our faith. Because at the end of the day, when we look at that relationship, we might not feel it in that moment, but we're going to feel it later because of the peace and the joy and the love that surpasses all understanding. That we might not feel in that moment, but we'll feel later in our life. Wish we had time to answer this question, but I think it plays to show that what are things that we might do as Christians regardless of how we feel? And I wish we had more time to discuss that question, but think about that. Like what are things, and you don't have to answer, but what are things that we might do as Christians regardless of how we feel? Maybe it's like, hey, I'm gonna go be a part of someone's life that I have no business being a part of their life outside of Christ. Maybe there's something that sticks out as a red flag to you. You're like, you know what? I've always avoided that because it's uncomfortable. I've always avoided that because I just haven't wanted to be a part of that. What is that in your life that's driving you away from doing something because of a feeling, because of some emotion that you have, positive or negative? I think lastly, as we wrap up, our faith struggles when we don't realize the blessings of God and we don't return them back to Him. When we think about Noah, and after the whole flood goes on, after he builds the boat, he gets off the boat, and his family and all the animals start to come off, what is the first thing he does? He sacrifices the best animals of what he had. The best of what he had, he sacrifices to God. He doesn't give the leftovers. He doesn't give the blind animal or the animal that can't walk right. He gives the best of the best. And God said that was a sweet aroma to him. And in the text it says, to himself, he says, this covenant I'm going to keep with my people. I'm going to keep with the whole world, and I'm not going to flood this earth. And so I think we struggle sometimes in our faith when we don't realize that God has blessed us, when we don't take time to just push away all distractions and reflect back on the faith that we have. When we don't spend time considering the blessings that God has given us. And so this week, I hope you challenge yourself to kind of think about some of those. Think about some of those blessings that you have in your life that maybe you haven't recognized because you just haven't taken the time and slowed down to see who God is. In chapter 9 and verse 16, at the very end of the story, it's the covenant, right? It's the covenant between Noah and God. It says, when the bow is in the clouds, I will see it and remember the everlasting covenant between God and every living creature of all flesh that is on the earth. This should give us an unending excitement that God is an active part in the covenant with each of us as Christians. Because if you notice very closely, it says that God is reminded of the covenant that He has with His people. How? Because of the way that He looks back on earth in the rainbow that He has set as a reminder for Himself and for everyone else that He will never do this again. And so there should be an excitement about us and a hope within us that God is an active part on the side of His end of the covenant. So what are we going to do with that? And that is the story of Noah. I hope you'll consider this week some of those things, some of those questions that we've talked about. Maybe ask yourself those questions and reflect on those with your families and discuss those things. Thanks for being here tonight.